You should have asked who I was before deciding what I deserved. The sentence hadn't been spoken yet, but it hung in the air like something waiting to be born, just seconds before the glass tilted. The ballroom shimmered under warm chandelier light, gold reflections stretching across polished marble floors, the kind that made every step sound more important than it was. And Naomi Carter stood near the edge of it all in a tailored white suit that caught the light just enough to be noticed, but not enough to beg for attention. Her posture still, shoulders relaxed, one hand resting lightly against the stem of a crystal glass she hadn't touched, the faint scent of red wine and citrus polish drifting through the air as conversations folded over each other in low, practiced tones. Across from her, Victoria Ashford laughed too loudly at something that wasn't funny, the kind of laugh that claimed space instead of sharing it, her diamond bracelet catching flashes of light like tiny signals. Her gaze flicking toward Naomi not once but twice, measuring, dismissing, returning again as if something about Naomi's quiet presence irritated her more than open defiance ever could. And when Richard Ashford leaned in to greet a group of investors near the center of the room, Victoria stepped slightly forward, her smile tightening just enough to sharpen the edges, her heels clicking with precise intent as she closed the small distance between them. Naomi noticed the movement before she looked up, the subtle shift in air that comes when someone approaches with purpose, not curiosity, and she turned her head just enough to meet Victoria's eyes, calm, unreadable, not confrontational, just present, which somehow made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. "Excuse me," Victoria said, though there was no pause to allow an excuse. Her voice smooth but carrying an undertone that didn't belong in polite conversation. And then it happened in a motion so controlled it almost looked accidental. The tilt of her wrist, the slow arc of deep red wine leaving the glass, catching the light midair before landing across Naomi's shoulder and cascading down the clean white fabric like a stain that refused to apologize. The room didn't gasp. Not immediately. Instead it inhaled and held. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, where forks pause halfway to plates and conversations collapse mid-sentence. And somewhere near the bar, a man cleared his throat but didn't continue speaking, as if unsure which version of reality he was now standing in. Naomi didn't step back, didn't flinch, the cold wetness spreading across her sleeve and collarbone area, seeping into the fabric, heavy and undeniable, and for a brief second, all that existed was the contrast, red against white, intention against composure, power against restraint. Victoria tilted her head slightly, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said. But the apology landed lighter than the wine had, almost weightless, almost decorative, and a few people nearby let out small, uncertain laughs, the kind that search for permission from whoever holds the most authority in the room. Naomi lowered her gaze to the stain, watching the liquid settle, the fabric absorbing it without resistance. And she reached for a napkin from a passing tray with steady fingers, dabbing once, not to erase it, but to acknowledge it. Her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if she refused to let the moment dictate her pace. Victoria shifted her weight, clearly expecting something louder, sharper, something she could react to, something that would confirm whatever assumption she had already made. But Naomi offered none of it, just silence, controlled and precise, the kind that forces everyone else to become aware of their own discomfort. Somewhere behind them, a camera flash went off, too late to capture the act, but perfectly timed to illuminate its aftermath, freezing the image of a woman in white marked by someone else's decision. Richard glanced over briefly, distracted, not yet understanding the shape of what had just unfolded, and turned back to his conversation, trusting the room to manage itself the way it always had. Naomi finally lifted her eyes again, meeting Victoria's gaze with something softer than anger and stronger than embarrassment, something that didn't ask for acknowledgment and didn't offer forgiveness, just presence, unshaken and quietly firm. And for the first time, Victoria's smile flickered, just slightly, as if the outcome she expected had taken a step in the wrong direction. The music resumed a fraction too early, a string section trying to stitch normalcy back together. But it didn't quite hold, not with the stain still visible, not with the tension still threading through every glance and half-finished sentence. and Naomi placed the damp napkin onto a nearby tray, her hand steady, her shoulders still squared, her breath even, as if she had already decided something no one else in the room had caught up to yet. Then, very calmly, she spoke, not loud, not sharp, just clear enough to cut through the fragile noise that had returned, and the words landed with a weight that didn't need volume to be felt, because they didn't just respond to what had happened, they reframed it entirely. And suddenly the room wasn't just watching a social misstep anymore. It was standing on the edge of something far more precise, far more consequential, something that hadn't revealed itself yet, but was already shifting the ground beneath polished shoes and practiced smiles. And that's when a phone started vibrating in Richard's pocket. The vibration was soft at first, almost polite, but it did not stop, a steady pulse against Richard Ashford's tailored jacket that refused to be ignored, and he shifted slightly, trying to continue his conversation as if nothing had shifted in the room. But the man in front of him had already noticed the pause, the way Richard's attention fractured for just a second too long, across the ballroom. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, her white suit now marked with deep red that had begun to dry along the seams, the faint scent of wine rising subtly with the warmth of the room, and she did not look down again, did not check the stain, as if acknowledging it once had been enough, as if the mark belonged more to the moment than to her. Victoria Ashford exhaled a small breath through her nose, the kind meant to signal boredom rather than discomfort, though her fingers adjusted the stem of her glass twice in quick succession, a rhythm just slightly off from her earlier confidence. And she glanced around, searching for confirmation that the room still belonged to her, that nothing had truly changed. A few guests offered polite smiles, but none held for long, and a waiter passing by slowed almost imperceptibly, eyes flicking between Naomi and Victoria before continuing on, the clink of glasses on his tray louder than it should have been. Richard finally slipped his hand into his pocket, pressing the phone against the vibration to quiet it, offering a quick apology to the investors in front of him, his smile practiced but thinner. Now, and when he glanced at the screen, the name alone was enough to pull his attention fully away from the conversation. Ethan Brooks, not a man who called twice in a row unless something required immediate attention. Richard turned slightly, stepping away from the center of the room, his voice lowering as he answered, but the tone on the other end cut through any attempt at casualness. Urgent, precise, the kind of voice that carried numbers and consequences even when it whispered. Naomi watched none of this directly, yet she seemed aware of it all, the shift in posture, the change in breath patterns, the subtle tightening of shoulders across the room, and she lifted her chin just slightly, not in defiance, not in pride, but in quiet alignment with something only she fully understood. Victoria noticed that movement, and it irritated her more than it should have, because it did not look like embarrassment. It did not look like someone who had just been put in their place, and she took a half step closer, her voice lower now, meant only for Naomi. You can have someone take care of that, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the stain, as if offering help she did not intend to give, as if the gesture itself restored balance. Naomi met her gaze again, calm, steady, the kind of eye contact that did not ask for permission to exist, and for a brief second, Victoria felt something unfamiliar, not quite fear, not quite doubt, but something that did not fit neatly into her understanding of control. Across the room, Richard's voice dropped further, his back turning slightly as he listened, the color in his face shifting almost imperceptibly, the lines around his mouth tightening as Ethan spoke, and one of the investors he had been speaking with earlier glanced toward him, then toward Naomi, then back again, as if connecting pieces that had not been visible moments before. The music continued, but it felt thinner now, like a layer placed over something unresolved. And conversations resumed in fragments, quieter, less certain, the kind that paused too often and restarted without conviction. Naomi reached for another napkin, this time not to dab at the stain, but to fold it carefully between her fingers, the motion slow, controlled, almost meditative, and the small act seemed to ground her more than any apology or explanation could have. Victoria shifted again, her heel making a sharper sound against the marble, and she lifted her chin, reclaiming posture if not certainty. Enjoy the rest of your evening, she said, the words polished, dismissive, an attempt to close a moment that refused to end. Naomi did not move to leave, did not respond with politeness or resistance, just remained present in a way that made departure feel like surrender and silence feel like something else entirely. Richard turned back toward the room, phone still in hand, his expression no longer matching the easy confidence he had worn at the start of the night, and his eyes found Naomi almost immediately, as if drawn there by something he could not yet name, something that had already begun to rearrange the hierarchy he thought he understood. He took a step forward, then stopped, recalculating. The distance between them suddenly more significant than it had been minutes ago, and the investors nearby followed his gaze, their own expressions shifting from casual interest to something more deliberate. Naomi did not acknowledge him yet, her attention still resting lightly on Victoria, as if allowing the moment to complete itself before anything else could begin, and the air between them held a quiet tension that no one in the room could ignore anymore. Richard swallowed, his grip tightening slightly around the phone as Ethan's last words echoed in his mind, precise and irreversible, and for the first time that evening he was no longer certain he was the one controlling what happened next. Then he looked at Naomi again, this time without assumption. The distance between assumption and truth narrowed without warning, and no one in the room seemed ready for how quickly it was closing. Richard Ashford took another step forward, slower this time, as if the polished marble beneath his shoes had turned uncertain, his gaze fixed on Naomi Carter with a focus that no longer belonged to casual curiosity, and the phone in his hand felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried, the quiet authority of confirmation that could not be undone. Naomi stood exactly as she had before, shoulders relaxed, chin level, the deep red stain across her white suit no longer drawing the most attention in the room, because something else had begun to surface, something less visible, but far more disruptive. And she did not rush to fill the silence, did not explain herself, did not offer context, as if she understood that truth did not need to compete for space, it only needed time. Victoria Ashford shifted again, this time more noticeably, her confidence adjusting like a garment that no longer fit the moment, and she let out a small laugh that landed awkwardly. "Richard, what is it?" she asked, her tone light, but searching, trying to anchor the situation back to something familiar, something she could control. But Richard did not answer immediately, his eyes still on Naomi, as if recalculating everything he thought he knew about the woman standing a few feet away. Across the room, whispers began to form, not loud, not coordinated, but enough to ripple through the edges of conversation, fragments of curiosity passing from one guest to another, a name mentioned here, a title questioned there, and one investor near the bar discreetly pulled out his phone, scrolling quickly, his brow tightening as he compared what he saw on the screen to the woman in front of him. Naomi noticed none of it outwardly. Or perhaps she noticed all of it and chose not to react, her hands now still at her sides, the folded napkin no longer needed, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but refused to be dismissed. Victoria followed Richard's gaze, her eyes landing on Naomi again. But this time there was a hesitation, brief but undeniable, as if the certainty that had fueled her earlier actions had encountered resistance, and she straightened her posture, reclaiming composure with deliberate precision. "If there is an issue, we can handle it privately," she said, her voice lowering, attempting to reduce the moment back into something manageable, something that did not involve an audience. Naomi's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, not anger, not satisfaction, just clarity. The kind that comes when a situation reveals itself exactly as it is, without distortion. Richard finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier ease. "Naomi Carter," he said, not as a question, not quite as a statement, more like a realization spoken out loud, and the name moved through the nearby space with more weight than anyone expected, because names, in rooms like this, carried currency, history, consequence. Victoria blinked once. Then again, the name not immediately connecting, or perhaps connecting too slowly for her comfort, and she tilted her head slightly, searching her memory, her social map of who mattered and who did not. But the map was shifting, and she could feel it. One of the investors stepped closer, his tone careful, almost respectful, Carter Group? He asked, not directly to Naomi but into the space around her, as if testing the possibility before committing to it, and another guest turned, recognition flickering across his face, the kind that spreads quickly once it finds a foothold. Naomi let a small breath pass through her lips, not a sigh, not relief, just a natural release of air, and she met Richard's gaze fully now, no longer allowing the moment to hover without acknowledgment, and there was no triumph in her expression, no need to prove anything beyond what was already becoming evident. Victoria's grip on her glass tightened slightly, the stem pressing against her fingers as she looked from Naomi to Richard and back again, her mind catching up in fragments, each piece landing a second too late, and the room, once aligned with her, no longer felt as predictable as it had moments ago. Richard took another step, closing the distance just enough to signal that whatever this was, it was no longer peripheral, and his voice dropped even further, meant only for Naomi. "You are the final sign-off," he said, the words careful, measured, carrying both realization and the beginning of something else, something like concern. Naomi held his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm. "Even. I am," she replied, and the simplicity of it cut through every assumption that had filled the room just minutes before. Victoria inhaled sharply, not loud enough to draw attention but enough to disrupt her own composure, and she looked around again, this time not for validation but for understanding, trying to locate where control had shifted and how far it had gone. The investor by the bar lowered his phone slowly, his expression now fully changed, no longer casual, no longer distant, and he glanced toward Richard with something that resembled caution. Naomi remained still, grounded in a way that did not require movement, as if the room itself had begun to orbit around a truth it had failed to recognize, and she did not rush to speak again, allowing the weight of what had just been acknowledged to settle fully into the space. Richard exhaled, the sound barely audible, but it carried with it the first trace of something unfamiliar, uncertainty, and he glanced briefly at Victoria before returning his focus to Naomi, as if understanding that whatever came next would not follow the script he had prepared for this evening. And for the first time, Victoria did not know what to say. Silence settled in a way that no music could cover, stretching across the room like something fragile that no one wanted to break first, and Naomi Carter did not move within it, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer overlooked but not yet fully understood, as if the room itself was still catching up to the weight of her name. Victoria Ashford's lips parted slightly, then pressed together again, the confidence she had worn earlier now searching for footing, and she adjusted her bracelet. With a small, precise motion that carried more tension than elegance, her eyes flicking once toward Richard, then back to Naomi, as if expecting someone else to correct what had just been said. Richard, however, did not correct anything, his gaze steady, his mind moving through calculations that no longer involved numbers alone but consequences, reputation, timing, and the irreversible nature of public moments. And he slipped his phone into his pocket slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging that whatever confirmation it had delivered was now fully in the room. "If that is the case," Victoria said finally, her voice smoother now, carefully measured, "then perhaps there has been a misunderstanding." And the word misunderstanding lingered in the air, an attempt to soften what had been deliberate, to reframe intention as accident. But even as she spoke it, the room did not fully accept it, the earlier silence having already recorded too much. Naomi's eyes remained on Victoria, calm, steady, and when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen, it simply carried. "There was no misunderstanding," she said, and the clarity of it left no space for reinterpretation, no room to reshape what had already happened. A faint shift moved through the guests nearby, the kind that comes when people begin to realign themselves, not physically at first, but socially, emotionally, quietly recalibrating where they stood in relation to what was unfolding, and one couple near the edge of the room stepped slightly back, creating a subtle distance from the center without drawing attention to it. Richard exhaled slowly, his hand brushing briefly against his jacket as if grounding himself, and he stepped closer, positioning himself between Naomi and Victoria, but not fully blocking either of them. His presence now less about control and more about containment. about trying to manage a moment that had already expanded beyond his reach. Naomi, he began, using her name with intention now, not assumption. I think we can resolve this. And his tone carried something new, not quite apology, not quite negotiation, but the early shape of both. Naomi did not respond immediately, allowing his words to settle, her gaze shifting briefly past him to the wider room, taking in the faces that had watched, the ones that had looked away, the ones that were now paying closer attention than before. And there was no accusation in her expression, only awareness, as if she understood that moments like this were never contained to just two people. Victoria's posture straightened again, reclaiming form even as substance slipped, and she stepped slightly forward, unwilling to be sidelined in a conversation that now defined her. We do not need to make this into something larger than it is, she said, her tone firmer, though not as secure as before, and a few heads turned toward her, drawn by the attempt to reassert control. Naomi's gaze returned to her, steady, unhurried, and for a brief second, the two women stood in a balance that no one else in the room could influence. One holding on to authority she had always known, the other standing in a truth that did not need to be granted. It already is, Naomi replied, the words simple, not dramatic, but they landed with a weight that shifted the air again, because they did not escalate the moment, they defined it. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the realization settling deeper now, and he glanced around, noticing the attention. The quiet observation that had replaced casual conversation. The way people were no longer just guests but witnesses, and he understood that whatever came next would not stay within these walls. Near the bar, the investor who had searched Naomi's name stepped closer, his expression now fully attentive, and he exchanged a brief look with another partner, something unspoken passing between them, something that suggested alignment. Reconsideration. Distance. Naomi's hands remained still at her sides, her shoulders relaxed, and the red stain across her suit, once the center of attention, now felt almost secondary, a visible marker of something that had already been understood without it. Victoria inhaled again, deeper this time, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something unguarded in her expression, not quite regret, not yet, but the beginning of recognition that the rules she had relied on might not apply here in the way she expected. Richard turned fully toward Naomi now, no longer dividing his attention, and his voice lowered, more direct. What would you like to do? He asked, the question careful, deliberate, carrying both inquiry and consequence. Naomi held his gaze, the room quieting further as if leaning in without moving, and she did not answer right away, not because she did not know, but because she understood the value of letting the question exist for a moment, letting everyone feel the space where a decision would soon be made, and somewhere behind them, a glass was set down just a little too hard. The sound of glass meeting marble lingered longer than it should have, a sharp note in an otherwise controlled room, and it drew just enough attention to remind everyone that this moment was no longer contained, that it had edges now, and Naomi Carter did not turn toward the sound, did not allow it to redirect her focus, because the question Richard had asked still hung between them, precise and unavoidable. She let a breath settle in her chest before answering, not rushed, not delayed, just measured, and when she spoke, her voice carried evenly. I would like this room to understand what just happened, she said, and the words did not rise, did not accuse, they simply placed the moment in full view, removing any chance of quiet dismissal. A faint shift passed through the guests again, the kind that comes when people realize they are no longer observers but participants, even in their silence. And a man near the back straightened his posture slightly, as if the act of listening now required more intention than before. Richard's expression tightened, not in resistance but in recognition, and he nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging that the conversation had moved beyond private repair, that whatever resolution might exist would have to live in the same space where the damage had occurred. Victoria Ashford's shoulders drew back, her chin lifting in a controlled motion that attempted to restore authority, and she gave a small, practiced smile that did not quite align with the tension in her eyes. This is unnecessary, she said, her tone light but firm. It was an accident, and the word accident landed again, softer this time, less convincing. because it had already been challenged, already placed under a light that did not allow it to hold its original shape. Naomi did not look away, her gaze steady, her presence unshaken, and she spoke again, just as calmly. "It was a decision," she said, and the simplicity of the correction made it harder to deflect, because it did not escalate. It clarified. A woman standing near the center of the room shifted her weight, her expression thoughtful, and she glanced briefly at Victoria before looking back at Naomi, as if reconsidering something she had assumed moments earlier. Richard exhaled quietly, his hand moving to adjust the cuff of his sleeve, a small gesture that carried more tension than it should have, and he looked at Victoria, not with accusation but with a question that did not need words, something like, how did this happen here, now, in front of all of them? Victoria felt the shift, the subtle withdrawal of certainty from the room, and she stepped slightly closer, her voice lowering. "We are not going to turn this into a spectacle," she said, the control in her tone sharper now, more deliberate, but the word spectacle itself revealed more than she intended, because it acknowledged the visibility she had tried to deny. Naomi's expression remained unchanged, but there was a quiet firmness in her posture, a stillness that did not yield, and she turned her gaze briefly toward the surrounding guests, not scanning, not searching, just acknowledging their presence, their witness, before returning her attention to Victoria. "It became visible the moment you chose to make it visible," she said, and the room absorbed the statement without interruption, because it did not feel like an argument. It felt like fact. Near the bar, the investor who had recognized her earlier crossed his arms loosely, his stance shifting from casual to attentive, and another guest beside him nodded almost imperceptibly, as if aligning with something that had finally been named. Richard's jaw tightened again, and he stepped half a pace closer to Naomi, his voice lower now, more direct. "What are you asking for?" he said, and the question carried weight, not just of resolution but of consequence, because it implied that something would follow, something that could not simply be undone. Naomi held his gaze, her eyes steady, and for a brief moment, there was a softness there, not weakness, not hesitation, but something human, something that acknowledged the complexity of what she was about to say, and she spoke without raising her voice. "Accountability," she said, the word landing with quiet precision, not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. Victoria's fingers tightened around her glass again, the tension now visible despite her effort to contain it, and she let out a small breath that did not quite reach the surface, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to reassert control through focus alone. But the room was no longer responding the way it had before. A server passed by slowly, his steps more careful now, as if aware that even the smallest movement might interrupt something significant, and the soft clink of glassware felt almost deliberate, as though the room itself was holding its breath between sounds. Naomi remained still, grounded, the red stain on her suit no longer the defining element of her presence, but a quiet reminder of the moment that had led them here. And she did not elaborate on the word she had chosen, did not explain it, because she understood that its meaning was already clear. Richard nodded once more, slower this time, the weight of the situation settling fully into his posture, and he glanced briefly at Victoria before returning his attention to Naomi, as if recognizing that whatever came next would require more than surface correction, more than a simple apology. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, then paused, the words not forming as easily as they had earlier, and for the first time, there was a visible gap between her intention and her control, a hesitation that the room noticed even if no one acknowledged it out loud. Naomi watched her, not with expectation, not with pressure, just with presence, allowing the silence to do what it needed to do, to stretch, to reveal, to settle, and somewhere near the entrance, someone quietly closed the door. The word accountability did not echo. It settled, heavy and precise, like something the room had been avoiding naming until now. And Naomi Carter did not move after saying it, did not reinforce it with explanation or emphasis, because she understood that the power of it was not in repetition but in presence. Victoria Ashford let out a controlled breath, her lips pressing together before she forced a small, composed smile, the kind that had carried her through countless social situations. But this time it felt thinner, less certain. "Of course," she said, her voice smooth again, carefully reconstructed. If you feel offended, I can apologize. And the phrasing hung there, conditional, measured, shifting responsibility subtly away from the act and onto Naomi's perception of it. A few guests exchanged brief glances, the nuance not lost on them. The difference between apology and acknowledgment registering in quiet ways that did not need to be spoken. Naomi's eyes remained steady, and she tilted her head just slightly, not in challenge, but in clarity. It is not about how I feel, she said, her voice calm. Even, it is about what you did. And the distinction landed cleanly, removing the option to reduce the moment into something subjective. Richard's gaze moved between them, his posture tightening as the conversation sharpened in a way he could no longer soften, and he lifted a hand briefly as if to intervene, then let it fall, recognizing that interruption now would only deepen the fracture already forming. Victoria's fingers adjusted her bracelet again, the small motion betraying a tension she could not fully conceal, and she gave a short, controlled nod. Then let me be clear, she said, her tone firmer now, more direct. I am sorry for the misunderstanding. And again the word returned, reshaped but not removed, an attempt to reframe intention without surrendering it. Naomi did not look away, her expression unchanged, and for a brief moment, the silence between them carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because it revealed exactly what was missing. Near the edge of the room, Sophie Miller, who had been standing quietly with a tray earlier, now lingered without one, her eyes fixed on the exchange, her posture still but attentive, as if she had witnessed more than just the visible moment, something in her expression suggesting that what had happened did not begin with the wine. Naomi took a slow breath, the movement subtle but grounding, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same steady calm. An apology without ownership does not change anything, she said, not as a reprimand, not as a lesson, but as a simple truth, and the words did not demand agreement. They revealed absence. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the weight of the situation pressing more visibly now, and he stepped closer, his voice lower, more urgent. Victoria, he said, not loudly, but with a tone that carried both warning and request, as if urging her to recognize what was at stake beyond the immediate moment. Victoria's gaze flicked toward him, irritation flashing briefly before being smoothed over, and she straightened again, drawing herself back into the posture she trusted, the one that had always worked before. We are not going to stand here and dissect this in front of everyone, she said, her voice controlled but edged. If there is something to resolve, we can do it privately. And the suggestion carried an attempt to move the conversation away from witnesses, away from consequence. Naomi's eyes moved past her for a brief second, taking in the room, the faces that had watched, the ones that had looked away earlier, the ones that were now fully present, and she returned her gaze to Victoria with the same quiet steadiness. It did not happen privately, she said, and the simplicity of it closed the door on that option without force. A subtle shift passed through the guests again, a quiet alignment forming, not loud, not unanimous, but noticeable, and the investor near the bar uncrossed his arms, his stance now more open but more deliberate, as if he had made a decision about where he stood. Sophie took a small step forward, not enough to draw full attention, but enough to place herself closer to the edge of the moment, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her expression composed but carrying a trace of something else, something like resolve. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and he looked at Naomi again, this time without calculation, without assumption, just with the recognition that the situation had moved beyond control into accountability in its truest form, and he nodded once, as if accepting that whatever came next would have to meet that standard. Victoria's grip on her glass loosened slightly, then tightened. Again, the motion small but visible, and for the first time, her gaze did not immediately return to Naomi, instead flicking briefly toward the surrounding room, as if measuring how much had shifted, how much she had lost without fully understanding when it happened. Naomi remained still, her presence grounded, the red stain on her suit no longer a mark of embarrassment, but a quiet symbol of the moment that had revealed something deeper, something the room could no longer ignore. And just then, Sophie cleared her throat softly. Sophie Miller did not raise her voice. but the soft clearing of her throat carried farther than it should have, cutting gently through the tension that had settled across the room. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not want to, but because something about her hesitation demanded space. Naomi's eyes shifted toward her, not sharply, not with surprise, but with a quiet acknowledgment, as if she had already sensed that someone else had been holding a piece of this moment, waiting for the right time to place it down. Victoria turned slightly, her expression tightening as she registered the interruption, her posture adjusting again, preparing to contain whatever might come next. But Sophie did not step back, did not retreat into the background where she had stood before. Instead, she took a small step forward, just enough to be seen clearly, her hands still clasped lightly in front of her, her shoulders drawn in but steady. "I think," Sophie began, her voice careful but not uncertain. "It was not an accident." And the words landed without force, without accusation, but with a kind of clarity that made them difficult to dismiss. A subtle ripple moved through the guests again, the shift more pronounced this time, because it did not come from Naomi, did not come from someone directly involved. It came from a witness, and witnesses change the weight of a story. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, the first visible sign of irritation no longer fully concealed. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharper now, the control in it thinner, stretched by the situation, and Sophie held her gaze for a brief second before looking down and then back up again, grounding herself in the moment she had chosen not to avoid. "You spoke to her earlier," Sophie continued, her voice still calm, still measured, near the entrance, before the wine. And the room leaned in without moving, the details beginning to take shape, the timeline filling in where assumptions had once stood. Naomi remained still, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her breathing, a recognition that the moment was expanding beyond her own words, that truth was beginning to surface from more than one direction. Richard's attention snapped fully to Sophie now, his posture straightening, his focus sharpening, because this was no longer about interpretation, it was about sequence, about intent, about something that could not be smoothed over with language alone. Victoria let out a small, controlled laugh, the sound short, dismissive, but it did not carry the same ease it had earlier. "I speak to many people," she said, her tone cool. "That does not mean anything." But the response came a fraction too quickly, as if it had been prepared before the full statement had even been heard. Sophie nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding it, and she took another small breath, her fingers tightening together for just a moment before relaxing again. "You asked her if she was staff," she said, the words simple, direct, and the room absorbed them with a quiet intensity, because they reframed the moment before the wine. They placed context where there had been none. A few guests exchanged glances, the pieces aligning now in a way that did not require explanation, and the investor near the bar shifted his stance again, his attention fully anchored to the unfolding exchange. Victoria's jaw tightened, the composure she had been rebuilding beginning to show strain, and she lifted her chin slightly. "That is a reasonable question at an event like this," she replied, her voice controlled but edged. "There is no offense in that." And the justification hung in the air, thinner now, less supported than before. Naomi's gaze remained steady, her presence unchanged, and she did not interrupt, did not add to Sophie's words, allowing them to stand on their own, to carry their own weight. Sophie nodded once more, her voice soft but unwavering. "She answered you," she said, "and you did not listen." And the simplicity of it cut through the layered explanations, reducing the moment to something clear, something undeniable. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound heavier this time, and he ran a hand briefly along his jaw, the gesture revealing more tension than he intended, because the situation had moved beyond social misstep into something defined, something that could not be reframed without ignoring what had just been said. Victoria's grip on her glass tightened again, her knuckles paling slightly, and she looked around the room, searching for alignment, for support, but the faces she met were no longer as certain, no longer as aligned with her version of the moment. Naomi finally shifted her weight slightly, a small movement that drew attention not because it was dramatic, but because it was the first one she had made in several minutes. And she looked at Sophie with a quiet acknowledgment, not gratitude, not surprise, just recognition. Sophie held that look for a brief second, then lowered her gaze again. Her role in the moment complete, her presence still but no longer hidden. The room felt different now. Not louder, not more chaotic, but more defined, as if something that had been uncertain had settled into place. And Richard looked at Victoria again, this time with a question that no longer needed to be asked out loud, and Victoria did not answer. The absence of an answer from Victoria Ashford did more than any denial could have. It stretched the silence into something undeniable, something that no longer belonged to interpretation, and Naomi Carter did not rush to fill it, because she understood that silence, when held long enough, reveals more than words ever could. The room remained still, not frozen, but suspended, as if every person present had become aware that they were standing inside a moment that would be remembered differently. Depending on what happened next, Richard shifted his weight slightly, the controlled movements of a man used to navigating complex negotiations now carrying a different kind of weight, one that did not respond to contracts or numbers. And he looked at Victoria again, this time without expectation, as if waiting not for the right answer, but for any answer at all. Victoria's lips parted, then pressed together again, her gaze moving briefly across the room, catching fragments of attention that no longer aligned with her. And for a brief second, something unguarded passed through her expression, not quite regret, not fully recognition, but something closer to realization that the moment had moved beyond her ability to define it. Naomi's posture remained steady, her presence unchanged, and she turned her head slightly, her eyes moving across the room not to seek validation but to acknowledge the space itself, the people who had witnessed, the ones who had remained silent, the ones who had begun to understand. And when her gaze returned to Victoria, it carried the same calm clarity as before. "This is not about embarrassment," Naomi said quietly, her voice even, measured. "It is about respect." And the word respect settled differently than the others had, not as a demand, but as a standard, something that existed whether or not it was acknowledged. A man near the center of the room lowered his glass slowly, his attention fixed, and a woman beside him nodded faintly, the kind of small movement that signaled agreement without needing to be spoken. Richard inhaled deeply, the breath controlled but heavier than before, and he stepped slightly closer, his voice low but firm. "Victoria," he said again, this time with a weight that carried beyond personal concern, beyond private tension, something that acknowledged the broader consequence now unfolding. Victoria turned toward him, her eyes sharper now, the defensive edge returning, but it did not carry the same authority it had earlier. "I have already addressed it," she said, her tone tighter, less fluid. "There is nothing more to say." And the statement landed as an attempt to close something that had clearly not ended. Naomi watched her for a brief moment, her expression unchanged, and then she shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition. "There is always more to say when something real has happened," she replied, her voice still calm, still steady, and the simplicity of it left no space for dismissal. Sophie remained near the edge of the moment, her posture quiet but present, her eyes moving between Naomi and Victoria, and she did not speak again, because what she had already said had done its work, had shifted the ground in a way that did not require repetition. Richard's gaze moved briefly toward Sophie, then back to Naomi, and there was a subtle change in his expression now, something less guarded, less calculated, as if he was beginning to see the situation not just as a problem to manage, but as something that required acknowledgment on a deeper level. Victoria exhaled sharply, the sound controlled but carrying frustration, and she adjusted her stance, one foot shifting slightly, as if preparing to step away, to disengage, but the room did not allow it, the attention too present, the moment too defined. Naomi's hands remained still at her sides, her shoulders relaxed, and the red stain on her suit had darkened slightly as it dried, no longer fresh, no longer spreading, but still visible, a quiet marker of what had occurred and what had followed. "Respect does not depend on who is watching," Naomi continued, her voice soft but clear. "It shows when you think no one is paying attention." And the statement moved through the room with a quiet force, because it did not accuse, it revealed, and several guests shifted subtly, the weight of it landing in different ways depending on what they had seen. what they had ignored. Richard lowered his gaze for a brief second, the words settling. And when he looked back up, there was a trace of something new in his expression, not just concern, not just calculation, but understanding, the kind that comes when a situation is no longer abstract. Victoria's jaw tightened again, her composure holding but strained, and she looked at Naomi with a steadiness that felt more like resistance than control. "You are making this into something it does not need to be," she said, her voice quieter now, but edged, and the statement carried less certainty than before, more insistence than belief. Naomi held her gaze, unflinching, her presence steady, and she did not respond immediately, allowing the words to exist without challenge, without reinforcement, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with everything that had already been said, everything that had already been understood. The music in the background softened, almost fading, as if the room itself had adjusted to the weight of the moment, and no one reached to turn it up. Richard glanced around once more, taking in the faces, the attention, the quiet alignment that had begun to form, and he realized that whatever happened next would not be contained to this evening, to this room, to this conversation. Naomi shifted her gaze briefly toward him, then back to Victoria, her expression unchanged, her voice quiet when she finally spoke again. "It already is," she said, and the words did not escalate. They settled, and for a moment, no one moved. The stillness did not break, it deepened, settling into the space between every breath and every glance. And Naomi Carter remained at its center without claiming it, without directing it, simply allowing it to exist, because she understood that moments like this did not need force to grow, they only needed truth to remain unchallenged. Richard Ashford shifted his stance again, the subtle movement carrying more weight now than any words he had spoken earlier, and he looked at Victoria with a gaze that no longer asked for alignment, but demanded awareness, something in his expression quietly acknowledging that the room had already chosen how it would remember this. Victoria held her posture, her chin still lifted, but there was a visible tension now, a slight rigidity in the way she stood, as if maintaining composure required more effort than it had before, and she glanced around once more, searching not for approval, but for something to anchor herself to, something familiar, but the room no longer offered it. Naomi's eyes moved briefly across the guests again, not lingering on any one face, just acknowledging the collective presence, and she could feel the shift, the quiet realignment of perception. The way people who had once looked past her were now looking directly at her, not with curiosity, but with recognition. Near the bar, the investor who had spoken earlier stepped forward just enough to be heard without interrupting, his voice measured. "Careful, Ms. Carter," he said, and the use of her name, her title, carried a weight that did not need to be explained. It simply confirmed what the room was already beginning to understand. Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, acknowledging him with a small, composed nod, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. "We were not aware you would be attending in person tonight," he continued, his tone respectful, and a few nearby guests shifted their attention toward him, drawn by the clarity of his words, because they did not question her identity, they affirmed it. Richard's shoulders lowered just slightly, the tension redistributing rather than disappearing, and he exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that carried both realization and consequence, because the moment was no longer ambiguous. It had been named, confirmed, and witnessed. Victoria's gaze snapped briefly toward the investor, then back to Naomi, and something in her expression tightened again, the last fragments of denial struggling against what had already been established. "That does not change what happened," she said, her voice quieter now, but edged, and the statement carried a different intention this time, not dismissal, but resistance, as if trying to separate the act from the identity, the moment from the consequence. Naomi met her gaze without hesitation, her eyes calm, unwavering, and she spoke with the same measured clarity. "It does not change what happened," she agreed, and the agreement, simple as it was, shifted the direction of the conversation, because it removed any argument about status, about position, and returned the focus to the act itself. A faint murmur moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but present, the kind of sound that forms when understanding begins to spread, and a woman near the back lowered her voice as she spoke quietly to the person beside her, her eyes still fixed on Naomi. Sophie remained where she stood, her posture steady, her expression thoughtful, and she watched as the moment unfolded further, her earlier words now part of something larger, something that no longer needed her to support it. Richard looked at Naomi again, his expression more open now, less guarded, and there was a trace of something else there, something like respect, or perhaps the beginning of it, and he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging not just her position, but her composure, the way she had held the moment without letting it fracture. Victoria inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling with the breath, and, for a brief second, the room seemed to narrow around her, the space she had once controlled now feeling less certain, less predictable, and she adjusted her stance again, one foot shifting slightly as if preparing to step away, but she did not move. Naomi's hands remained still, her shoulders relaxed, and the red stain across her suit had settled into the fabric, no longer spreading, no longer fresh, but still visible. A quiet reminder that what had happened could not be undone, only addressed. "You asked what I would like to do," Naomi said, her voice calm, directed now toward Richard, but audible to those nearby, and the room seemed to lean in again, not physically, but with attention, with anticipation. Richard held her gaze, his posture steady, his expression attentive, and he nodded once, slowly. "Yes," he said, the word simple, but carrying weight. Naomi paused for a brief moment, not for effect, but for clarity, allowing the space to settle before she continued, and when she spoke again, her voice remained even, controlled. "I would like the truth to be acknowledged without being softened," she said, and the request, if it could be called that, did not sound like a demand, it sounded like a standard. Victoria's eyes flickered, the words landing differently than the others had, because they did not leave room for interpretation, for adjustment, for distance, and she opened her mouth slightly, then closed it again, the response not forming as easily as before. Richard's gaze moved briefly toward her, then back to Naomi, and there was a quiet understanding in his expression now, something that suggested he knew what was being asked, and what it would require. The room held its breath again, not out of shock, but out of anticipation, because the next words, whoever spoke them, would define more than just this moment. And Victoria finally drew in a deeper breath. Victoria Ashford's breath lingered in her chest a second too long before she let it out, controlled but heavier than before, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried less polish, less certainty. "Fine," she said, the words short, clipped. "You want clarity." And she straightened her shoulders again, reclaiming posture even as the room no longer fully responded to it. "Then I will be clear," she continued, her gaze locking onto Naomi Carter with a steadiness that felt more defensive than composed. The room leaned in without movement, every small sound fading into the background, the quiet hum of the chandelier lights, the faint clink of glass somewhere distant, all reduced to nothing against the weight of what was about to be said. Naomi did not move, did not shift her stance, her presence grounded, her expression calm, and she did not interrupt, because she understood that truth, when forced into the open, often reveals more than intention ever planned to admit. Victoria lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady but edged. "I saw someone who did not belong in that space," she said, and the words landed with a sharpness that did not need to be raised to be felt, because they carried more than just observation. They carried assumption, judgment, something deeper than a single moment. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. A shift in collective breath, in posture, in awareness, and a few guests glanced at each other briefly before returning their attention to the center. Richard Ashford's expression tightened, his jaw setting as the words settled into the air, heavier than anything that had been said before, and he took a half-step forward as if to interrupt, then stopped, recognizing that interruption now would not undo what had already been spoken. Naomi's eyes remained steady, her gaze unwavering, and for a brief second, there was something softer there, not acceptance, not forgiveness, but understanding, the kind that comes from having heard words like these before, in different rooms, in different forms, but carrying the same meaning. Victoria continued, her voice holding, though the edges of it showed strain. And I acted accordingly, she said, and the sentence, simple as it was, removed any remaining space for reinterpretation. Because it did not hide behind misunderstanding, it did not soften itself into accident. It stood exactly as it was. A man near the bar lowered his head slightly, his expression shifting into something more serious, and the woman beside him crossed her arms loosely, her attention fixed, her earlier neutrality replaced by something more defined. Naomi took a slow breath, the movement subtle but grounding, and she nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgment, as if recognizing that the truth, once spoken, no longer needed to be pursued. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose, the sound controlled but carrying weight, and he ran a hand briefly across his mouth, the gesture revealing more tension than he intended. Because this was no longer a situation he could manage quietly, it had crossed into something public, something that would extend beyond this room. Victoria, he said again, his voice lower now, firmer, but the name carried less authority than before, more urgency, more recognition of consequence, and he glanced around, taking in the faces, the attention, the quiet alignment that had formed without announcement. Victoria did not look at him this time, her gaze still fixed on Naomi, as if holding eye contact could preserve some sense of control, but there was a flicker there now, something uncertain, something that had not been present earlier. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, and the red stain across her suit seemed almost secondary now, a detail that no longer defined the moment, because something far more significant had been revealed, something that could not be cleaned, could not be undone. "Thank you," Naomi said quietly, her voice even, and the words surprised more than one person in the room, not because of their content, but because of their tone, because they did not carry sarcasm, did not carry victory, they carried acknowledgment, the kind that follows truth rather than reaction. Victoria blinked once, the response not matching what she expected, and for a brief second, her composure faltered, just slightly, before she steadied it again, her shoulders drawing back, her chin lifting, but the posture felt different now, less certain, more constructed. Richard looked at Naomi, his expression shifting again, something deeper settling in, something that went beyond the immediate moment, beyond the deal, beyond the room, and he nodded slowly, as if recognizing that what had just been said could not be separated from what would come next. Naomi's gaze moved briefly across the room, acknowledging the witnesses, the silence, the understanding that had taken shape, and when her eyes returned to Richard, there was clarity there, not sharp, not cold, just precise. "Now you know," she said, her voice calm, and the words did not accuse, they informed, they placed the reality fully in front of him, without distortion, without protection. Richard inhaled deeply, the breath measured, and he nodded again, slower this time, as if accepting not just the truth of the moment, but the responsibility that came with it. Victoria's fingers loosened slightly around her glass, the tension shifting, and she glanced around once more, but the room no longer offered the same reflection it had before. The alignment had changed, quietly but completely. Naomi remained where she was, grounded, composed, her presence no longer questioned, no longer overlooked, and she did not move to leave, did not rush the moment forward, allowing it to settle into what it had become, and then Richard turned to face her fully. Richard Ashford faced Naomi Carter fully now, no longer angled, no longer divided between conversations or perceptions, and the shift in his posture was subtle but undeniable, the kind that signaled a man stepping out of assumption and into recognition, and he took a slow breath, the movement measured, as if aligning himself with something that could not be handled through instinct alone. Naomi held his gaze without tension, her expression calm, grounded, and she did not rush to speak, because she understood that the next words needed to come from him, not from pressure, not from expectation, but from clarity. The room remained still, the quiet no longer fragile but settled, as if everyone present had accepted that this moment would not be hurried, that whatever came next would define more than just the evening. Richard's voice, when it came, was lower than before, stripped of the casual authority he had carried earlier. "What happened here?" he said slowly, each word deliberate, should not have happened. And the sentence landed without flourish, without defense, just a plain acknowledgment that did not try to soften itself. A few guests shifted slightly, the sound of fabric moving against fabric barely audible, but enough to mark the shift, because acknowledgment from someone in his position carried weight. It changed the direction of the room in a way that could not be ignored. Victoria Ashford turned toward him. Sharply, her eyes narrowing, the control she had been holding now challenged from a different direction. "Richard," she said, her tone tight, a warning more than a name. But he did not look at her, not immediately, his focus still on Naomi, as if he understood that breaking eye contact now would weaken what he had just begun. Naomi remained still, her expression unchanged, but there was a slight softening in her eyes, not approval, not relief, just recognition that something had shifted, that the moment was no longer standing still. It was moving, slowly, but with intention. Richard continued, his voice steady. "There is no excuse for it." And the words came without hesitation this time, as if once he had crossed the line into acknowledgment, there was no reason to step back. Victoria's posture stiffened, her shoulders drawing back, the space between them now carrying tension that had not existed before, and she let out a controlled breath. "You are overreacting," she said, her voice quieter now but edged, the certainty in it no longer absolute. And a few heads turned toward her, the room no longer automatically aligning with her tone. Richard finally glanced at her, briefly, his expression composed but firm, and then returned his gaze to Naomi, choosing his focus with intention, and the choice itself said more than any argument could have. Naomi took a slow breath, the movement subtle, and she inclined her head slightly, not in submission, not in agreement, but in acknowledgment of what had been said, because she understood that recognition, when genuine, did not need to be amplified. The red stain on her suit had darkened further, settling into the fabric, no longer drawing immediate attention, but remaining present, a quiet reminder of the moment that had brought them here, near the bar. The investor who had spoken earlier shifted his stance again, his posture now fully engaged, his attention fixed on Richard, as if waiting to see how far this acknowledgment would go, how complete it would be. Sophie stood still, her hands now resting loosely at her sides, her earlier tension replaced by a quiet steadiness, as if the truth she had carried had finally found its place in the open. Richard's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension redistributing, and he spoke again, his voice carrying a different weight now, not just acknowledgment, but responsibility. "Naomi," he said, using her name with clarity, "I am sorry for what you experienced here tonight." And the apology, though simple, did not carry conditions, did not shift blame, it stayed where it belonged. The room absorbed it quietly, the difference between this and what had been offered earlier unmistakable, and a woman near the center of the room nodded faintly, the gesture small but meaningful. Victoria's expression tightened further, the distance between her and Richard now more visible, more defined, and she looked away for a brief second, her gaze moving across the room as if searching for something that was no longer there, something that had shifted without her consent. Naomi met Richard's gaze, her expression steady, and for a moment, there was silence again, not heavy, not tense, but reflective, as if the room itself was taking in what had just been said, measuring it, understanding it. She did not respond immediately, allowing the apology to stand on its own, to exist without immediate resolution, because she understood that acknowledgment was only one part of what accountability required. Richard held her gaze, waiting, not with impatience, but with a quiet readiness, as if prepared to hear whatever came next, even if it was not what he wanted. Victoria remained still, her posture held, but the certainty that had once defined it now fractured in small, visible ways. The edges no longer smooth, the control no longer complete. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm. "Even, that is a start," she said, and the words did not dismiss, did not accept fully. They simply placed the apology where it belonged, as a beginning, not an end. Richard nodded once, slowly, the weight of her response settling in, and he did not argue, did not push, because he understood that the moment required more than agreement, it required action. The room remained quiet, the attention still present, the alignment more defined now than it had been at the start of the evening. And then Naomi looked past him, briefly, toward Victoria. Naomi Carter's gaze moved past Richard and settled on Victoria Ashford with quiet precision, not sharp, not confrontational, but direct in a way that left no space to avoid it. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow again, not in tension, but in focus, as if everything that had unfolded was now leading to this single point. Victoria felt it before she fully met Naomi's eyes. The weight of attention shifting toward her, no longer passive, no longer divided, and she straightened slightly, drawing in a controlled breath, her posture attempting once more to reclaim the authority that had begun to slip. Naomi did not speak immediately, allowing the moment to exist, to settle, to make itself known without interruption, and when she finally did, her voice was calm, even, carrying no trace of urgency. "This is where it matters," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a clarity that reached beyond the immediate moment, beyond the room, into something more lasting. Victoria held her gaze, her expression composed but strained, the edges of control visible now, and she did not respond right away, as if searching for the right shape of words, the right tone that could restore balance, but the space for performance had already closed. Naomi continued, her voice steady. "Not what you say to him," she added, a brief glance toward Richard acknowledging his presence without shifting focus, "but what you are willing to say here," and the distinction settled into the room with quiet weight, because it removed the possibility of deflection, of shifting the conversation into something private, something contained. A faint movement passed through the guests, a subtle realignment, the kind that happens when a moment becomes collective, when it is no longer about individuals alone but about what is witnessed, what is understood. Victoria's fingers loosened slightly around her glass, then tightened again, the small motion betraying the tension she could no longer fully conceal, and she exhaled slowly, her eyes remaining on Naomi, the space between them holding steady. Richard did not speak, did not intervene, his posture still, his gaze moving briefly between them before settling again, as if recognizing that this was not his moment to shape. Naomi's shoulders remained relaxed, her stance grounded, and the red stain across her suit, now fully set into the fabric, seemed almost symbolic, no longer an interruption, but a quiet presence that could not be ignored. "You said you saw someone who did not belong," Naomi continued, her voice soft but clear. "So say it again, and mean it." And the words did not challenge, did not provoke, they invited clarity. They asked for alignment between thought and language, between assumption and acknowledgment. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, chosen, and a man near the back shifted his weight slightly, the faint sound of his shoe against the floor marking the passage of a second that felt longer than it was. Victoria's gaze flickered for just a moment, a brief hesitation, and in that hesitation, something became visible, not to everyone, but to those who were paying close attention, something like the awareness of consequence, of how words, once spoken, cannot be reshaped once they have been heard. She drew in another breath, deeper this time, her shoulders rising and falling with it, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, less polished, more direct. "I misjudged you," she said, and the admission, though small, landed differently, because it did not hide behind misunderstanding, it did not shift the moment away. It placed responsibility closer to where it belonged. Naomi held her gaze, her expression unchanged, but there was a slight softening in her eyes, not acceptance, not forgiveness, just recognition that something had shifted, however slightly. Victoria continued, the words coming slower now, more deliberate, "And I acted in a way that was disrespectful," she added, and the sentence, though carefully formed, carried more weight than anything she had said before, because it acknowledged not just the act, but its nature. A quiet exhale moved through the room, almost collective, the kind that follows a moment of alignment, of truth spoken without deflection. Richard lowered his gaze briefly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, and when he looked back up, there was something steadier in his expression, something that suggested the beginning of resolution, though not its completion. Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words, not elevating them, not diminishing them, simply placing them where they belonged, as part of what had been asked. Sophie stood still at the edge, her expression calm, her earlier tension fully settled now, as if the truth she had carried had found its place, had been spoken in more than one voice. The room remained quiet, but it was a different quiet now, not heavy, not uncertain, but grounded, as if something had been set into place that could not be undone. Naomi's hands remained at her sides, her posture unchanged, and she did not rush to respond, allowing the acknowledgment to exist without immediate closure, because she understood that moments like this were not about speed, they were about substance. Victoria held her gaze for a second longer, then let it drop slightly, not in defeat, not fully, but in something closer to recognition, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Richard glanced around the room once more, the attention still present, the alignment clearer now, and he knew that what had just been said would travel beyond this space, would shape more than just this evening. Naomi finally took a small breath, the movement subtle, and she shifted her weight slightly, the first sign that the moment might begin to move forward, and then she reached for her glass. Naomi Carter's fingers closed gently around the stem of the glass, the cool surface steady against her touch, and for a moment, she simply held it there without lifting it, as if acknowledging the object that had marked the beginning of everything that had unfolded, and the room remained still, not in tension anymore, but in quiet attention, the kind that follows something resolved but not forgotten. She raised the glass slightly, not in a gesture of celebration, not in dismissal, just a small, controlled movement, and the faint reflection of the chandelier lights shimmered across its surface, catching the red tone that mirrored the stain on her suit, and she looked at it for a brief second before setting it back down untouched, the soft sound of glass meeting table barely audible, but enough to signal a shift. Richard Ashford watched the movement closely, his posture no longer rigid, no longer divided, and there was a steadiness in his expression now, something that had replaced the earlier calculation, something quieter, more grounded, and he inclined his head slightly, not formally, not performative, but in acknowledgment, as if recognizing that the moment did not belong to him to conclude. Victoria Ashford stood still, her shoulders no longer drawn back in the same way, the tension in her posture easing into something less defined, less certain, and her gaze lowered briefly, not fully, not completely, but enough to suggest that the certainty she had held at the beginning of the evening had shifted into something else, something quieter, something she had not planned to encounter. Naomi turned her head slightly, her eyes moving across the room one last time, not searching, not measuring, just observing, and the faces she saw now were different, not because they had changed, but because the way they looked at her had. There was recognition there, respect, something unspoken but present, and she did not linger on any one expression, because she did not need to. Sophie Miller remained near the edge, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture relaxed now, and she watched Naomi with a quiet sense of understanding, as if the moment had confirmed something she had always believed but had not yet seen so clearly. The music, which had faded into the background, began to rise again slightly, not enough to reclaim the room, but enough to remind everyone that time had not stopped, that the evening would continue, even if it would not be remembered the same way it had been expected to. Naomi adjusted the cuff of her sleeve gently, the fabric still marked, still carrying the deep red stain that no longer felt like an interruption, but like a part of the story that had just been written into the room, and she did not attempt to hide it, did not cover it, because it no longer needed to be concealed. Richard took a small step back, creating space without breaking connection, and he glanced briefly toward the investors who had been watching, his expression composed but changed, and one of them nodded slightly in return, the kind of acknowledgment that carried more than agreement, something like respect for how the moment had been handled, for what had been revealed. Victoria's fingers loosened around her glass, and she set it down carefully on the table beside her, the movement slower than it had been earlier, more deliberate, and she looked at Naomi again, not with challenge, not with dismissal, but with something quieter, something that had not been there before, something that did not need to be named. Naomi met her gaze for a brief second, not holding it long, just enough to acknowledge it, And there was no triumph in her expression, no need to claim victory, because what mattered had already been established, not through force, not through volume, but through clarity. She turned slightly then, her movement smooth, unhurried, and began to walk toward the edge of the room, her steps steady against the marble floor. The sound soft but distinct, and the space seemed to open in front of her without resistance. Guests shifting subtly to allow her passage, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Sophie stepped aside as Naomi passed, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod, and Naomi returned it just as quietly. The exchange brief but meaningful, a shared understanding that did not need words. Richard watched her go, his gaze following her for a moment longer than expected, and he exhaled slowly, the breath carrying the weight of everything that had changed, everything that would not return to what it had been. Victoria remained where she stood, her posture still, her gaze lingering in the direction Naomi had walked, and for the first time that evening, she did not speak, did not attempt to reclaim the moment, did not reshape it. She simply stood within it, as it was. Naomi reached the edge of the room and paused for a brief second, her hand brushing lightly against the door handle, the cool metal grounding, and she did not look back, not because she refused to, but because she did not need to. The moment behind her already complete in the way that mattered. She opened the door quietly, the sound soft, almost absorbed by the room, and stepped through, the hallway beyond dimmer, calmer, the air cooler against her skin, and the noise of the ballroom faded just slightly as the door moved toward closing. Inside, the room remained, the guests, the light, the memory of what had happened settling into place. And outside, Naomi continued forward, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, carrying nothing with her except what she had always had, and behind her, the room did not feel the same.